You see, I'm really a born foreigner, that's the truth. I'm that sort of, it's a regular English type, the person who doesn't live in England. But I don't rationalize that in the slightest. I mean, I think England is 1,000 times better in every way, I would say now. Or I mean, better for me, nearer to the kind of place that I would like it to be than it was when I was a boy. And I feel perfectly at home there. But foreign.
Today, Christopher Isherwood, the born foreigner, lives in California, a few miles north of Los Angeles, in a valley known as the Santa Monica Canyon.
Just over the top was where Aldous and Maria were living when I first came here.
The Huxleys, yes.
Yes. And I've also lived down there near the shore. Then the house that's used in a single man is right over there among the trees, and there were two other houses there and there. I've really always lived in the canyon, aside from a short period up in Hollywood when I first arrived.
Isherwood has described the canyon as crowded with cottages of self-consciously rustic design, where cranky, kindly people live and tolerate each other's mild and often charming eccentricities. An appropriate dwelling place, perhaps, for a man whose pattern of life and whose work as a writer have inevitably set him a little apart. Isherwood was born 65 years ago in Cheshire, the son of a professional soldier. He was sent to school at Repton, and from there he went as an exhibitioner to Corpus Christi, Cambridge. He describes himself at this time as upper middle class, Puritan, cautious and a bit stingy. At Cambridge, however, he spat fiercely in the eye of the establishment. Having refused to work for an expected first, he got himself sent down by writing nonsense answers in his exams. He became a private tutor for a while, did an unlikely year as a medical student, and then went to Berlin. It was 1930, the beginning of the decade in which he became clearly established as a writer. His stories of Berlin during the early Nazi years, Mr. Norris Changes Trains and Goodbye to Berlin, conveyed the decadent spirit of the German capital between the wars with startling vividness. Along with W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, Louis MacNeice, C. Day Lewis and the rest, Isherwood belongs inescapably to the group enshrined in 20th century English literature as the 30s writers. During that period, in addition to the Berlin books, he wrote articles and essays, his first scripts for films, and he collaborated with W.H. Auden to write a travel book and 3 plays. Today, Isherwood is a pacifist, a devotee of Vedanta, a form of Hinduism, and since 1946, an American citizen. All his life, he has kept copious diaries and notebooks. He doesn't feel secure, he says, unless he's writing out of his personal experience.
In my own life, I think I'm rather a past dismisser. In fact, I strongly suspect that it's a kind of protective device, that you sort of go on forging ahead with the immediate present and the specious future, and leave the past behind you very much. All this thing with memory to me is just a kind of inhibition. As long as I'm afraid I won't remember, or afraid of this or that, not getting things right, I'm inhibited. But if I can have just a few little precious sentences. For instance, when I was working on this movie, which is afterwards described in Prata Violet, I had the good sense one day, chiefly because I had nothing else to do, I wrote down in a notebook exactly what all the crew and everybody said to each other before a take. So out of the past, I had these precious voices speaking exactly the right kind of technical slang and talking exactly as they talked on that day all those years before, which was early 34. No, well, 33 and 34. It was the winter of 33, 34. And out of this, you'd be amazed. It simply gave me the confidence, you know. I could invent. I didn't want to reconstruct the past, but I like cues like that, something to get you into a thing. This book I'm writing now about my mother and father, which has me in it. I just put myself in the third person. I don't dream of imputing anything to this person, because I honestly don't know.
But, yes, would you impute to the others, to your parents, for instance?
No, I don't have to, because I have my mother's diaries, you see, and I base everything, I approach the whole thing in a historical spirit, as though I were Professor Trevor Roper or somebody. I reconstruct her. And my father, and my father's letters and all this. It's terribly interesting and quite absorbing. And I have theories, which I put down as theories about her behavior. But I'm so interested there how absolutely unreliable my memory is. It's incredible. I mean, I was absolutely under the impression that there were tremendous scenes where Irish snipers fired on my father's regiment from the housetops. Well, I guess they did, but I can't find anything about it in my mother's diary at all. And I really wonder if I didn't make the whole thing up. And I make up quotations from books. I used to drive Auden absolutely out of his mind trying to find things I'd told him. They just weren't there. I don't mean to, but I mean, that's the kind of way the thing works. You see, there's a big sort of redecorating job going on the past the whole time. And I don't want to be told what the room used to look like. I want to make it like it used to look like, according to me.
You have written a great deal about your own life from the years of a schoolboy onwards. In fact, there's very little about your father. Why was that?
Well, of course, I didn't know him well at all. He was dead by the time I was 10. He died in 1915. Yes, I was 10, that's right. On May the 9th. He was killed in the war, in the First World War, near Ypres. And now I'm starting to write about him because, you see, it's only very recently that I've read his letters and had a great added insight into him. I was in a very difficult position psychologically right after his death, because the establishment, that's to say the people at my school and so on, said he's a hero. Now, normally I would have said anything that you admire or like is vile, and therefore he's not a hero. But I really did like my father very much. He was a marvelous person.
Your reactions as a young man, as an undergraduate, when you've written about them, you explained how you felt always that there was a need to undergo some kind of test. In other words, that you felt you had to prove yourself because you had been deprived of the opportunity of being in the war. Now, do you think that in this lay the seeds of your subsequent pacifism?
That's very, very hard to say. I don't think so necessarily, because another process went on, undoubtedly, which was discovering that it didn't matter one tiny bit what my elders or anybody else said about me. One of my favorite Shakespeare quotations at that period was from the sonnets, "No, I am that I am, and they that level against at my abuses reckon up their own." You know, and I gradually realized that one just doesn't have to, one should not concern oneself with what other people say or what they tell you is your duty. Your duty is what you find out for yourself. And having discovered this, whether I became a pacifist or not was another can of beans altogether, I think. I mean, I might have decided to become anything.
But you don't feel that there was any or subconscious rejection of the militarism that was embodied in your father?
Well, you see, It's very hard to say now, looking back about that, but I don't think I identified him with militarism, because I always felt very much that it was his job. And while he was quite a good soldier, he was the least military creature. I mean, really, he was, in a way, his undoubted heroism was even kind of unmilitary. There's a marvelous story about how when the men were first under fire in the trenches, and of course, in those days, no troops had experienced anything like this before for a long time. And I suppose most of them had not even, heard guns fired in anger, as they say. And now here was a bombardment. And my father was I think he was a major, then he became a colonel before he died, sat down in the bottom of the trench and started knitting a sweater for himself. And the men sort of laughed at him, and said, "Isn't it? Look at the major doing this,
In the early 30s, Isherwood spent 4 years in Berlin, where he gave private lessons in English and gathered the material for his Berlin stories. Later, they were to be adapted as I Am a Camera. Isherwood described the German capital like this.
Berlin was in a state of civil war. Hate exploded suddenly, without warning, out of nowhere. At midnight, after breakfast, in the middle of the afternoon. My pupils looked at the photographs in the newspapers and shook their heads, apologizing to me for the state of Germany. Dear, dear, they said, it's terrible, it can't go on. Uniformed Nazis strode hither and thither, with serious set faces, as though on weighty errands. People smiled approvingly at these youngsters in their big, swaggering boots, who were going to upset the Treaty of Versailles. They were suddenly proud of being blonde, and they thrilled with a furtive, sensual pleasure like schoolboys, because the Jews, their business rivals, had been satisfactorily found guilty of the defeat and the inflation, and were going to catch it. When Hitler comes, he'll show these Jews a thing or two. They won't be so cheeky then.
Die große Zeit ist jetzt angebrochen, auf die wir 14 Jahre lang gehofft hatten. Deutschland ist nun erwacht.
The city, which glowed so brightly and invitingly in the night sky above the plains, is cold and cruel and dead. Its warmth is an illusion, a mirage of the winter desert.
Does it strike you as at all ironic that your greatest fame has come through the things which you haven't actually written? I refer to I Am a Camera, which was based on your stories of Berlin, and also currently Cabaret. Is this something which you find maddening, comic, or what?
Oh, I don't find it maddening at all. Any ruffled feelings that I might have been soothed by checks arriving, like sort of poultices laid on the throbbing boil of wounded self-conceit. No, I was really very grateful indeed to John Van Druten for writing this, which after all was the foundation of the whole dramatization and the later musical, writing this play, I Am a Camera. It was extraordinary how it happened. It was really the doing of Dodie Smith, as he was the first to admit. When she was out here, he came to lunch one day and they were discussing things that you couldn't possibly turn into plays. And Dodie, as she afterwards admitted with a good deal of intention, said, of course, you could never make a play out of Chris's Berlin stories. And Johnny, who was a terrific eager beaver and loved being set problems, said, oh, I don't know. And he went off, and I think that evening he phoned her and said, I've already blocked out the first half of the play. And my goodness, a few days later, he'd actually written a draft. And then they told me.
It was 1931, New Year's Eve, in fact. Money was short. The book was getting nowhere. So I stayed at home and stared out of the window.
I Am a Camera was filmed in 1955.
Berlin in those days was a dreary, hopeless place. But I took refuge in a very convenient phrase. Said I to myself, I am a camera. Good title.
Until I settled here, I was almost always working under appalling difficulties. You know, I was living in some rather dark and uncomfortable kind of lodgings somewhere or other. You see, after I was grown up, I hardly lived in England at all. I never had a home of my own in England, and the only places I did stay when I came to England were houses of my friends, or else my mother's house. Well, I had my room there. But that was the only other place where I've really been able to sit down comfortably and work. In my life, I used to work on cafe tables and in sort of dark bedrooms where there wasn't a proper desk and all sorts of places.
One of the strongest influences on the life and work of Christopher Isherwood has undoubtedly been the deep and enduring relationship with Wystan Auden. They collaborated professionally to write 3 plays, The Ascent of F6, The Dog Beneath the Skin, and On the Frontier, all of which enjoyed a succès d'estime in London before the war. They were commissioned to write a travel book about the East, and in January 1938 they left England for China and the Sino-Japanese War.
I'd always longed to go to China, and we were sort of, we were actually going to Spain originally. We'd promised to, with a whole bunch of writers and artists and people who, you know, those kind of delegations used to visit the trenches and sort of louse up the war for while everybody was allowed to, I don't know, fire a rifle or something. But they put it off and put it off and put it off, and then this publishers, the American publishers, Random House, said, we'll give you money to write a travel book together. And so we thought, well, how marvelous, we go to China, where we have a war all to ourselves. Nobody's been there. And it'll be exciting and marvelous, and we'll see China, and which I'd always longed to do. And so it was all decided immediately, and off we went.
The story of the China trip was published as Journey into War. Isherwood wrote the prose, Auden the verse.
Here war is simple, like a monument. A telephone is speaking to a man. Flags on a map assert that troops were sent. A boy brings milk in bowls. There is a plan for living men in terror of their lives, who thirst at 9, who are to thirst at noon, and can be lost, and are, and miss their wives, and, unlike an idea, can die too soon. Far off, the hollow, approaching roar of the bombers, the dull, punching thud of bombs falling, near the airfield, out in the suburbs. It was as tremendous as Beethoven, but wrong, a cosmic offense, an insult to the whole of nature and the entire earth. I don't know if I was frightened. Something inside me was flapping about like a fish. In 10 minutes it was all over, and they had gone. Though we wear out our shoes walking the slums, though we take notes, though we are genuinely shocked and indignant, we belong unescapably to the other world. And the well-meaning tourist, the liberal and humanitarian intellectual, can only wring his hands over all this and exclaim, "Oh dear, things are so awful here, so complicated. One doesn't know where to start."
Here were we with our whole atmosphere of our very old friendship, because, you know, when we met when we were very small boys in school, with our own jokes and our own kind of way of looking at things, traveling along and getting accredited and meeting famous people and finally wangling to go to the front and all this, and going there and coming back again, and air raids and this and that. Nothing very horrendous, but you know. And it was also strange because it was, in a way, like a sort of back to the school days thing, you know. I mean, we were sort of laughing at each other like crazy, you know, in sort of embarrassing moments, you know. I remember one time we were in a sort of a trench in the middle of a field, and the plane was kind of circling around, kind of looking at the whole terrain. It was just behind the front line. And Auden was busy taking photographs of me looking up at the plane, and he said, "You looked so wonderful with your great nose cleaving the summer air."
Yes.
Well, you know, I was just remarking on that as being a sort of typical memory which came out of the whole thing, you know. That it was all, we seemed to be, we were in fits of laughter most of the time. And yet, of course, what we saw was often appalling and very serious, and there was, these two things were going on kind of simultaneously. There's always a tremendous sense in my life, always, of masquerade, and I suppose there is in most people's lives. I mean, it seemed not only in my life, but I mean in the, I see, as it were, the masquerade in my friends' lives. And by masquerade, I don't mean anything false, but I just mean that what the world does to them doesn't seem to jive with my picture of them. It was very strange, for instance, to see Auden preaching in Westminster Abbey, as I did, I think it was last time I was over, which all happened quite naturally, but it was nevertheless terribly funny. And when the great trumpets rang out, you know, and the dean and everybody appeared all in robes, you know, and I whispered to Stephen, "It's Whiston's cue." And we were laughing like dogs, you know, as he appeared. And yet, you know, it was marvelous, and he gave a wonderful sermon. I've always felt, and this does go back into my young manhood as well, that having opinions is a sort of art form, and has its own validity, quite aside from the validity of the opinions themselves, provided that they're cogently expressed and forcefully expressed. For instance, you see, spending a lot of time with Auden, who is a most marvelous creator of opinions that you can imagine. He has opinions about everything you can imagine, down from what sort of cream you should use in your coffee. Everything is the only possible. And he'll have opinions about the most unlikely things, and the most unlikely opinions. For instance, he might say, well, of course, Antony and Cleopatra is entirely about cooking. And you say, cooking? But no, by God, somehow or other, he proves it, you know. He really kind of makes a case for it. Now, I'm not about to argue with him or contradict. I mean, one listens in fascination. And I must say, when it comes down to reading literary criticism, I'm not so drawn to the people who exhibit marvelous justice and a kind of perfect equity and good taste. I'd much rather read rampageous and, as many would say, wrong-headed criticism, like, for instance, D.H. Lawrence's studies in classic American literature, or any of these works, because it has passion in it. And as I say, it's an art form.
But do you not have passionate opinions that you hold?
Yes, I do, but I don't seem to have this urge to express them in writing. I cannot help kidding them a little bit, because I cannot help feeling that they're so subjective and so much just for me.
Does this mean that you're always faced with the problem of seeing the other point of view?
Yes, except that makes me sound so dreadfully humane and civilized.
Which you're not.
No, not really. I sort of unwillingly see the other point of view. It is something, of course, to do with being a novelist, surely, isn't it? I mean, when you think of a character, you think of them in a sort of gestalt way. I mean, you see the person, how he or she looks, and how he or she talks, dresses, what kind of people they associate with, and along with all this comes their opinions. And so you begin to see opinions as a kind of function of an individual. And this makes you take a rather objective stand toward them.
Does this extend to your work? If it's right for you, do you mind what others say about it?
Well, one always minds not being understood. But yes, if I, in the instances where I felt that some part of something I did was absolutely what I wanted to do, then I really don't care what other people think. Except that I'm pleased, of course, if they like it. But I mean, I'm not moved by what they say.
And this, of course, would extend then to literary critics writing about your work.
Mm-hmm. But then again, there are other things where the literary critics really convinced me, pointed out cracks in the structure, which I have to admit are there. And I think, no, what one minds about literary critics much more is that some of them sometimes seem to be really quite unnecessarily vicious. There's a very unfortunate tradition, particularly in this country, in New York, of people who feel that they haven't reviewed a book which they don't like unless they've impugned the author's whole honor and existence, and indeed his right to write at all. This I find very unnecessary, and personally I've long since given up reviewing, except just when I can praise a book wholeheartedly, I'll sometimes review it.
I wonder, do you have the same proprietary feelings about the screenplays that you've done for movies as you do about your novels and your other writing?
No, I don't think one could unless one were a writer-director with very complete powers over the production. You see, I think that movies are made by directors in the first place. And when I'm writing for a movie, especially if I respect the director at all, I feel absolutely part of a team. I never feel it's my movie. My chief desire is to know what the director wants. Of course, the best director-writer relationship I've been in has been with Tony Richardson. And there it was absolutely ideal because he knows exactly what he wants, and at the same time isn't autocratic at all. He knows how to let you know what he wants and still give you wide freedom about the way you express it.
Tell me about the others.
They were a mixed lot. I make lots of mistakes.
Tell me about them.
There was one who bought everything, from a white tuxedo to lavender toilet water. He couldn't live without it. Another one arrived aboard and said, regularity is health, and did 45 on deck 3 times a day. One read Hegel. He thought it could give me great insight into my present condition. So I gave him enough money to read Hegel for a year ashore. But worst of all was the one who believed in God. He felt sorry for the sailor. and wanted to pray for him.
Any others?
The others were not as amusing. Oh, yes. There's one I've forgotten. All his life, he worked in a registry office. He wanted just one thing, to polish the brasswork on a boat. All his life, he waited for... What were you waiting for?
What's anyone waiting for?
The sailor from Gibraltar.
I'm obviously a frustrated actor, and not so frustrated because, I mean, who would want to act in some silly old play where somebody else wrote the lines when you can act all on your own, like I'm doing now, or anywhere, you know, or you can get up on a platform in front of all these people. Of course, I have a very, very fortunate and happy life. I almost invariably do what I want to do, or at least what I think I want to do at that moment. I adore teaching. I have lots of fun when I do work in the movies or something of this kind. It's not at all a drag. I like the extrovert quality of working with other people, and I like collaborating. I like the sort of chess problem side of it very much indeed. I love plotting and planning and constructing and so forth. And of course, one's own work, while it's often maddening when it won't come out right, is very, very absorbing.
Isherwood's novel, A Single Man, was published in 1964, and he regards it as his most successful to date. It's set in territory that's very familiar to him, the campus of a Californian university. The central character, George, is a rueful, middle-aged, homosexual professor of English who commutes between the college and his home at the other end of the freeway. And the novel is a study of the man in relation to his students and the community in which he lives. A community just outside Los Angeles and which seems remarkably like Santa Monica.
It's extremely unwise to identify me too much with George. And I think if you really want to criticize George as a character, the trouble is that he is in places rather badly joined together. The parts which are me don't altogether jive with the parts that are George. You see, I see George as a person of enormous stoicism. And his kind of stoicism is something which is really quite foreign to my nature. And in that way, I think he's very different. But the house where he's supposed to live, all the settings of the places that he goes to, and the college, the gym, the hospital even, those are all taken from life and from experiences. All the people. You know, originally that book was not about George at all. One of my favorite American writers is Willa Cather. And this is very much the attraction of opposites. And I felt how wonderful to write a tremendously kind of simple, massive book about a character. And I wanted to write about a woman who'd married a GI and come out here from England. It was going to be called An English Woman. And it was going to be all about this woman. I knew everything about her. And her marriage, and how she'd been attracted at first by the kind of wildness of this GI. But as they got older, they rather changed roles, and she became a kind of English eccentric. And he became very respectable. And finally he left her. And he left her with an adolescent son, late teenager. And this son was going to be the link with the narrator. In other words, the narrator is teaching in a college somewhere and meets the son, and the son says, "You're British, you ought to meet my mother." And so he gets to meet her and learns all her tragedy and so on. Well, I started to write the book this way. And then I I don't know, that voice, the sort of impatient voice from inside said, what are we fussing around with this woman for? You know, let's sort of get down to the interesting part. And so poor old Charlotte, she's still in the book, but she only has a kind of a minor role. And all this stuff about her marriage and all the other things and about the son and everything happens off stage. It's really enough to write another book about. But I had a tremendous flash of imagination of how to describe the kind of Anglo-American imbroglio in a marriage, you know. I thought it would be amusing.
You've written that you are rather fascinated and enthralled by the sense of impermanence that you get here, Los Angeles particularly.
Yes, well, of course, in a way, this country is fundamentally a desert country. It's a country which has been kind of adapted and planted and settled, but nevertheless it is desert country. And there is always a certain sense of the mirage about it. But you know, I like that. It appeals to me altogether. Of course, as a devotee of Hindu philosophy, it's very much like the Hindu account of the universe as being just a kind of projection or maya. And sometimes the great noble traditional buildings of Europe seem rather too solid in comparison. Here on the coast it's all rather dreamy and strange and kind of merging. And it's very characteristic that one travels in this town, you know, and you simply cannot recognize a street because they've built some other things on it. And since it really always consisted of large billboards and signs and neon more than buildings, you can change the whole place by just changing the lights. There's a sort of theatrical impermanence in that sense.
But you have a particular affection for this.
I adore this area, yes.
Yeah.
I think this has a wonderful kind of horror. But gradually, they're tearing down the shacky part and putting up big new buildings. This is where where it goes out to the sea, you see. Isn't that wonderful and really perfect Antonioni scenery, I feel?
Yes, it is.
You can just imagine Monica Vitti, a terrible sulk about something, wandering about on the beach in despair and frowning. It's quite a sort of Sunday amusement to park here and just sit watching the boats go by and seeing people quarreling on board. The way they always seem to on boats.
Indeed. But the change in something like this since you've been here
It's tremendous,
really,
yes.
they're both tremendous, but at the same time it's the kind of thing that you like, this impermanence, isn't it? Which is,
yes, it's sort of fascinating. You wonder what to see next. The only thing is that, of course, a lot of this stuff will be all right as soon as it becomes obsolete and becomes ruins,
Yes.
you know, again. What you have to endure is the awful period when it's brand new and is simply ugly in a rather ordinary way.
When you go back to England, how do you feel? Does it feel like a strange country to you? Are you embarrassed by being there? What does it feel like? Do you feel English or American?
Well, I feel basically English and always will. There's no question about that at all. As for it being a strange country, you see, as I think I said earlier, I've lived so much out of England, not only just here, but when I was young, I was in Germany for 3.5, 4 years, however much it was, and then travelled and lived in Belgium and Holland and France and down at the Canary Islands and all over the place, in Portugal too. And so the sensation of it being rather strange is nothing new. I just feel it makes me appreciate it more.
There has been a considerable relaxation of all sorts of things in England now. And I mean, the laws relating to homosexuality, for instance, have been, as you know, completely changed. Is there the same tolerant attitude now in America?
If you took the whole of the United States into account, you would find everything from the next best thing to making it legal, all the way down to kids being sent to prison for 10, 15 years. There's some absolutely barbaric statutes in some of the states. You know, life imprisonment, extraordinary things with regard to it. And I don't mean, I'm not now speaking of any interference with minors. I'm speaking of consenting adults. It's incredible. You see, we've got one leg in a morass of Puritanism still, and the other leg sort of uncertainly feeling a foothold somewhere else.
And in California?
Well, friends of mine who've been psychiatrists and people who've been concerned with trying to get the law changed have been sort of moderately optimistic. Everybody says it'll be changed. But you see, that's the sort of maddening thing about human beings, that people can all agree it'll be changed and then sit down under it for another 10 years for no particular reason. Apathy, really. The Hindus always say that's the really terrible thing, is apathy. Apathy is far worse than violence, because violence can always turn to its opposite, which is love and constructive action. By violence, I mean destructive violence. But that apathy is a kind of awful swamp in which we wallow until we're pulled out of it.
You've made a great study of Hindu philosophy, haven't you? You've translated it and you've written about it.
I would never, never, never have taken even an interest in it, let alone been able to understand it, if it hadn't been that I met this very remarkable man who is a monk here. He's a Hindu monk, a member of a Hindu religious order. And his name is Swami Prabhavananda. And first of all, either Gerald Hurd or Aldous Huxley met him, but anyway, then they both met him. And so I got introduced to him. And that was quite shortly after I arrived. And this was one of the major experiences in my life, certainly. And I've remained a very close friend of his and a student ever since.
You say that it was a profound experience meeting him. Can you explain what it meant to you at that time?
Well, what anything like that means, if it really means anything, is simply that it provides you with a sort of ultimate resource, some kind of thing that you can turn to when what one calls one's own resources are exhausted, and a sort of reassurance that you won't just go screaming mad or flip under pressure. Or that even if one does flip, this is sort of irrelevant. I mean, there's even something, there's still something behind you even after you've flipped. It's all part of this thing that I have such a tremendous, eternally telling people, I'm sorry, I'm not that sort of person, the concept that my life is intentional. My life is not consciously intentional. It's all very well. People say, why did you decide this? Why did you decide that? It was decided for me by circumstances, is how I feel. Now, you may say that's just a kind of affectation, but it's how I feel, and I don't know any other way of describing my experiences except by saying that they happen to me.
Stay with us here on BBC4. There's comedy coming up tonight as the Olympic Deliverance Commission bumble their way towards the imminent start of the Games. 2012 is next.